You want my good side or?
Yeah, that's a pretty good side.
Yeah, I like it.
Hey,
They're all the same.
Frank's getting the Tom Osborne Legacy Award tonight.
Mhm.
What does that mean to you, him getting this award?
Well, we've had some pretty notable guys here. Switzer was here, and Bobby Bowden, and some others. But I think for me tonight is probably the most important, because I think there's very few people that have accomplished as much in the world of football as Frank, and a lot of people don't realize that. But he was a great player at Nebraska. He was a great assistant. You know, he recruited Mike Rozier, Irving Fryer, the Peter brothers, Eric Crouch, and so two of the three Heisman Trophy winners. And he was just a solid guy as far as being an assistant. And so I felt very comfortable in him taking over, because he understood what buttons to push and what was unique about Nebraska and what had to happen. And so if you look at it, his winning percentage was better than Bobby Bowden, better than Joe Paterno, and about the same as Woody Hayes and Bear Bryant at Nebraska. And that's pretty good company. And won a Big 12 championship and three Big 12 Norths. So I thought he did a good job. And naturally, there's always some changes, some adjustments you have to make when you change staffs and people get older and all that type of thing. And then I think what he's accomplished at Ohio has been remarkable, because you look at a program that I think in 40, 50 years had one bowl game, and now he's gone to 10 out of the last 14 years. And if you win 8 or 9 games at Ohio, that's probably like winning 10 or 11 or maybe 12 games at a Power 5 conference, because you always have to play those 2 or 3 money games where you're really playing programs that are probably have more resources than what you have. So you're playing people like Ohio State and Michigan and places like that are really hard to win those games. So he's done a remarkable job there. And Frank now is the oldest serving coach in Division I football. You know, now that Bill Snyder has retired, he'll be the president of the American Football Coaches Association next year, which is indication of how people feel about him. And so he's a well-respected guy in the profession, and I'm just glad that he's able to come back tonight and meet with so many former players and some of the fans, and because I think that he certainly deserves something like this, and so I think it'll be a good event.
Have the two of you stayed pretty close over the years?
Yeah, I talked to Frank probably 4 or 5 times during his season, and probably 3 or 4 other times. So we speak more than about once a month or once every 2 or 3 weeks, and so we've stayed in touch for all these years, and we're good friends, and I'm a great admirer of Frank Solich. No, I think it's good for the program in general, and I think it's good for the fans. I think a lot of fans have felt uncomfortable with everything that happened with Frank, and so maybe some of them will have some closure. Maybe Frank will have a little bit of closure. He never talks about what happened, but it had to be hurtful, because there's no school that it was more important to Frank than Nebraska. You know, he played here. He was a high school coach here. He was an assistant for all those years, and so to not be here anymore had to be very painful. So anyway, he's a great coach, and I'm just glad he considered to come back.
Hey Tom, you watch a lot of college football. What struck you most about that game the other night, Alabama and Clemson? I mean, when you play that over in your mind, what do you see?
Well,
or what did you think?
Well, you know, Alabama ran the ball really well, but it seemed like Clemson really pushed all the right buttons in terms of blitzes and being able to get to the quarterback and pressuring the quarterback and causing what was a really good quarterback to make some mistakes. And then Clemson obviously has great team cohesion, and not that Alabama doesn't, but I just was really impressed because I don't think anybody thought Alabama would lose like that. I think a lot of people thought, well, maybe Clemson might win, but it would be down to the wire and a field goal or something. But it was really impressive to see Clemson do what they did. And,
Tom, you went through that run where you guys were 60-3. Both those teams are 55-4 over roughly a similar period. 55-4. Clemson's 55-4. Alabama's 55-4. Did you see? I mean, were your teams in that realm? Do you feel like, or do you think you
this is it's 20-some years later, and athletes probably have changed a little bit. Football's changed some, but for the time, for that time period, it was a pretty dominant period for us.
Yeah.
But again, I think the thing that you saw with Clemson was great team chemistry, and that's what we had was great team chemistry along with great athletes. Because usually, probably, even though I'm not a big NFL fan, probably the best measure of talent is how many of those guys go on and play in the NFL. And we had a huge number of guys off of those teams that went on and played in the NFL. Yeah.
Tom, you were on the playoff committee for a few years. And when you hear people say it needs to go to 8, talking heads kind of say that, what's your reaction when you kind of hear all the people trying to say it needs to expand already?
Well, the tough thing is that you're lengthening the season. You know, Dabo said that they were the first and only 15-0 team. Now, 15 games is a lot of games to play because you don't have the waiver wire in college football. In the NFL, if you get a player or two hurt, you can call somebody up on the phone that's been in your training camp or practice squad and plug them in. But in college athletics, you don't have that privilege, and so there's a lot of wear and tear. And I remember when Oregon played about 4 years ago, I think they were down an offensive lineman, a couple cornerbacks, a couple receivers, and they weren't the same team by the time they hit that championship game as they were earlier. So you gotta weigh that. Although I know that FCS does play a tournament with a lot of teams in it, and so if you're willing to give up the conference championship game, take that out of the equation, and make sure everybody plays the same number of games. Because right now, you know, you had Alabama 2 years ago that didn't play in the conference championship. You had Notre Dame this year that didn't play a conference championship, and that's a big hurdle. And that's a 50-50 game in a lot of cases, and you should have to have everybody do the same thing to get there. And so I think when somebody puts enough money on the table, there'll probably be an 8-team playoff. Seems that's the way it goes, but there is a trade-off because it's pretty hard on these kids to go to school and to play that number of games. And there is a wear and tear factor that's pretty significant.
Would you have been comfortable with your team playing 15? How would you have felt about it?
I wouldn't have been comfortable with it, but I guess if they said you had to do it, we'd do it. We certainly have done it. The players wouldn't have wanted to say, well, you know, we're not going to play anymore. They'd play, and but it's a tough grind, and just like Nebraska this year, I think they played 12 straight weeks, you know, and then you go in the next week and play a conference championship game, and then you get into a playoff, and well, that's a lot of football. These guys, they take a beating during that year.
Do you think it's important to preserve the history of the bowl games, and is it possible to have the historical bowl games with an 8-team playoff?
Well, I think the more playoff games you have, the less significant the bowl games become. And I think already with the 14 playoff, that's where the focus is. And so whether you play in the Rose Bowl or the Fiesta Bowl or the Sugar Bowl or the Orange Bowl, it's not that big a deal anymore as it once was. Because in those games, most people, you could figure out one way or another, a certain scenario, you could end up on top, even though maybe you lost 2 games, you know. And now with the situation like it is, I think it's gotten to where it's pretty hard to envision somebody ending up on top with the way it's arranged today. So.
Hey, I know somebody asked you about the playoffs. I want to ask you one more question too. You were in those rooms for the first couple of years. Did you sense that something's changed in the selection process since the 2 years you were in there? Because Barry Alvarez gave some quotes that seemed to indicate maybe there had been a shift, and I know Alvarez was in those first couple too.
Well, I don't know because I haven't been there, Sam. I don't know. But I do know that Barry and I sat side by side, and Tyrone Willingham was in the room. He'd been a coach, and I think it helps somewhat to have that perspective. We had a lot of ADs there. Condoleezza Rice was there. But one thing that Barry and I looked at was statistics, and one thing that we looked at was field position and the average possession. And the best teams usually were +6, +7 every time the ball turned over. And that was a measure of penalties. It was a measure of kicking game and turnovers. And so the teams that weren't so good usually had minus figures in that regard. And so we looked at a lot of things that I think the average person wouldn't look at. And we actually came up with a composite score. We each had our own system, but we had a numerical score as to the 1, 2, 3, 4 teams by the end of the year, because we had so much data and we had the time to go through it, and we kind of knew what it meant. And but it was a much more thorough process than what I used to do when I was a coach. And I'd look at our film in the evening on Saturday, and I had to have a ballot in by 2 a.m. And I'd just sit down and look at the computer and who won, who lost, and rearrange the deck chairs. And there wasn't a whole lot of thought that went into it. I'm sure that a lot of sports writers, it's about the same process. You just don't have the time to do it. So it's much more thorough, and I feel good about that. But I think it helps to have lots of different perspectives in the room, and Barry and I worked very closely together on how we looked at it. So.
Hey, Tom, real quick, you just jump in here at the end, but when you think about looking back at Scott's first season and how things went, what jumps out at you? What impressions do you have? Did it I don't know what expectations you had for how it would go for him, but how do you feel about things?
Well, I thought the most significant thing to me was that nobody panicked, and when you're 0-6, naturally there's a temptation to start pointing fingers or lashing out at players or other, and that didn't happen. And they still focused on teaching, on trying to get better, improving whatever needed to be improved. And so I was really impressed by their approach and how they went after it. And then, of course, toward the end, you saw steady progress, and you saw a team that was good enough. They just had some bad fortune, penalties at certain times, and some things that broke down in the kicking game. And so, but I thought they made steady progress, and that was really good. So I think the future is very bright for them.